Okay, welcome everyone. This is another installment of Flower Monthly November. And for this segment, we're going to be providing another one of our Federated Learning interview series. And so it's with great pleasure that I'm joined today by Charles Kerrigan. He is a partner at a law firm called CMS, and we'll learn more about them in a few moments. But as a by way of a preliminary introduction, I'd say that I first met Charles about 6 weeks ago on a call where we were talking about a lot of different issues to do with law intersecting with technology. And I really was taken aback by just how much CMS is willing to dive into the kind of technical nitty gritty. And I know that many of us out there doing AI have been hearing about this impending AI regulations of various kinds, and is sort of wondering what it's going to mean for us. How is the world going to change when it arrives? And I could think of no better person than Charles to have a conversation about this. So thank you, Charles, for joining us. I'll just share this little intro slide to the segment. And yeah, again, thank you, Charles, for joining us. And this is the interview series for Flower Labs, Flower Monthly, where we're going to tackle the topic of AI regulation and eventually get into this interesting intersection where AI regulation meets FL, but I imagine we'll talk about sort of the bigger issues to start with. Yeah, so thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Nick.
I just wanted to just start things off by it would be interesting to know about your background and how you got into not only AI regulation but all these sort of other technical areas that yourself and your law firm is interested in.
Yeah, sure. So when I started, there was AI, but there certainly wasn't AI regulation. I've worked in AI for about 12 years now. But I've been working as a lawyer for 25 years. And I started pretty traditionally. I did corporate finance work, so raising money for companies. And I specialized in doing that for technology companies. And then a lot of that became fintech. And fintech, through things like blockchain and crypto, leads to deep tech. And all of these things are kind of related. So I work in a team at the moment that is specialists who have background and expertise in the technologies associated with blockchain, AI, and similar. I think they're all somewhat related. Often the developers are the same people. I never met an AI developer that didn't own some Bitcoin. So these are families of technology with common aims and common developers. So if we think of them as digitalization technologies and automation, simplification, a lot of the transactional work that law firms and companies do can be abstracted into smart contracts and made quicker, more efficient, and that's to the benefit of the wider economy and lots of the projects. So I find myself, I guess, working across projects from startups, lots of devs as clients and connections through to biggest global companies, AI, crypto blockchain companies, large institutions, people putting capital into those markets. So the technology is extremely broad, and the type of things that require some legal support is hugely broad. You made that point about we have some level of understanding around the technology. I think in order to apply regulation, you've got to understand the fact pattern. And the fact pattern in technology that we're discussing here is it has some complexity. So you've got to have a background in that. The regulation is not hidden. The regulators publish the regulation. They have kind of materials on their website that describe in flowcharts and fairly simplified form how to figure out if you're inside or outside. So it's helping people translate from the developer community to the regulators and vice versa. So a lot of our job is kind of translators and explainers before we can then help people figure out how to comply with the rules. But really, we want people to be able to do the thing that they're trying to do, launch the product, launch the business. We're not here to tell people what they can't do. We're here to tell people how they can do what they want to do.
Interesting. And so I guess we've heard a lot about AI regulation, and AI safety as being also another hot button sort of issue that's kind of interdependent with that of late. And so I was wondering if from your sort of from your position, as someone who really understands the nitty-gritty of these things, what does the landscape of AI regulation look like today? What are the kind of main factors that exist in policy and rules and so on currently?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with a few headlines and we can
Hmm.
figure out which ones you want to dig into. So first, it's become more urgent. So I guess your audience listening here are not in the same position as lots of people. So there's a kind of, if you just read the newspaper, then AI beat Gary Kasparov at chess and then took a break and came back in November 2022. So um, obviously that's not right, but that is how it's been framed or perceived. So governments have now had a year to see just how big this thing is. And you get that from corporates. So corporates want to ensure that they're managing risk appropriately. Well, the easiest way of managing risk connected to AI systems is not to use AI systems. Um, but you can't do that. One, they're too good not to use. And two, they are available widely, like the internet. So if all of your customers are using AI, clearly you can't not use AI in a business. So we kind of crossed a few bridges in the last couple of years, and governments have got an initial question. Is it regulated on a domestic, national basis, or is it regulated on an international basis? Neither of those are quick, but domestic is quicker because the government can set policy and then it can control its own speed of regulation. So that's how it's tending to look, apart from in the EU, where the EU AI Act is a really significant piece of regulation, not so much for what it says, but for the fact that it exists. So we're about to have the final likely text drop in the next couple of weeks, and that will set off a process where businesses using AI systems in the EU or touching the EU got 2 years to comply.
Hmm.
So this looks a little bit like GDPR, a kind of new regulation and a period with which to get yourself organized as a business and make sure you're compliant. That will apply across the EU, and we can use it to illustrate some of the policy making that goes into regulation. So next point in the headlines, regulation doesn't kind of come out of nowhere. So regulators will generally use some existing regulation as a base
Hmm.
for new types of regulation. And in the EU, European regulation is generally consumer friendly. That was what GDPR was doing. It was trying to support the rights of consumers and provide transparency, information, and control to consumers. So the AI Act in the EU has those themes around it. It has a bunch of things in common with the GDPR. So we're not starting from nowhere.
Hmm.
It's possible to disagree with the policy behind it, but it's likely that this will have in common with GDPR that just its existence will mean that anybody else who's producing regulation for AI systems is going to be doing it with the EU's regulation in mind. You kind of now have something that you're going to be compared to, whether you like it or not. So it's really significant from that perspective. And then it's possible to see how different jurisdictions will take different approaches depending on their policy perspective. The US is starting to see regulation applicable to algorithms and AI systems. They tend to take more of an equity type approach. So the history of the US means that fair dealing, ensuring that there's no bias for protected classes of people. That's the kind of most significant thing that you see around US policy. So there's some predictability, I think, even where we don't have regulation text yet, you can see that the history of regulation in different jurisdictions
Mm.
has a theme to it, and therefore that tells you what approach different jurisdictions are likely to take to regulation for new topics.
It it seems that sort of contrasts a little bit what we saw from the Biden administration the last couple of weeks, where some of those statements seem to be centered more about any concerns of uh, what people might be able to build and being able to kind of like monitor and somewhat control. So there didn't seem to be so much following the line of equity, and maybe I might have misinterpreted it. It seemed to be following regulations to kind of measure and understand what should be what establishing boundaries of like where things need to be carefully monitored and where things will be less well monitored. Is that what you?
Yeah, yeah, I did. So maybe three quick points on that. So as you say, classification is significant, and that reflects the EU regulation. So if I were to sort of say, structurally, what any regulation for AI systems is going to have in common, and this is in broad terms how the EU Act does it. So you've got to identify where you're using AI systems. Often organizations currently have many hundreds or thousands of AI deployments, but they're not maintained in a central database. So when we go in to help people figure out how to comply with regulation and other risk management and policy matters, the first part is to identify all of the deployments in the organization. So you've
Mm,
got an identification layer, then you've got a classification layer, and that's the piece that you're describing. And then you've got a reporting layer. So if there's going to be a regulator who's looking over your shoulder, you've got to be providing information to them so they can see how you're doing. And then on that point around classification, that's what you raise. There's an obvious difference between, say, something like a recommender engine, where if it goes wrong and it's recommending films for you, well, you've watched a bad film and spent an hour and a half that you would have preferred to do something else in. That's trivial. Um, the opposite end of that, from the EU policy perspective, would be something like medical data, biometric data. So some of this is not problematic. There are lots of AI deployments that are low risk. They wouldn't cause harm. They don't affect things connected to human rights. So we can be satisfied from a policy perspective that they don't require a heavy hand on regulation. And then at the far end, things that maybe the EU regulation makes use of AI systems prohibited in certain respects. So everyone's kind of looking at the same structure of how you would regulate, and they've all got the same spectrum facing them. Now, they may reach different conclusions. You could say under one set of regulations, something would be considered high risk, that in a different jurisdiction's regulation, it would be considered maybe medium risk, but
mhm.
it's likely that most classifications will be somewhat similar. Then I think and the US point where I was describing sort of fair dealing and equity, some of that comes through in state regulation. So as you say, the Biden administration is looking at what the Americans would call federal regulation, so something that applies across the whole country. And
Mm,
meanwhile, states have been putting in place regulations. So New York, for example, has state level regulation relating to bias in things like housing or employment. So that type of regulation exists to some extent already. Obviously, rules relating to employment regulation, to employment and hiring practices already say there must not be bias in that decision making. And what we're seeing is layered on top of it that in large organizations where they have hundreds or thousands of applicants for roles that are arising constantly, then you'd naturally use some system to do some sifting. So it's logical and helpful to use that system for efficiency, and it's also obvious that there must be requirements that those systems are not acting in a way that demonstrates bias. So most of these things are pretty unobjectionable, the way they're built. And then the final thing, I said there were 3 points. So what kind of jumped out at me, and this is the piece that that you reference, is the US naturally had 2 new themes to it, I think, in the Biden administration's role. One is economic competitiveness, which, as you describe, is kind of on the agenda for them already in relation to chips for GPUs, the fastest chips, the best chips, being subject to some export restrictions. And second, there was reference to military uses and the value of AI systems in a military context. And we kind of knew that already because one of the landmark papers out of the US, maybe a couple of years ago now, it was huge. It was hundreds of pages, and I forget the name of it, but it had, I think Eric Schmidt was one of the supporters or authors of it, and that was framing AI from a defense and security
There's some
perspective.
sort of statement about AI's application in military and so forth.
Correct. Yeah. So
I
we
see.
know that would be an obvious use case. The ethicists and moral philosophers are all over this question of autonomous agents in battlefield contexts, and the US spends more on its military than whatever is it the top kind of next 6 or 7 countries combined. So
Sure.
these kind of deep tech applications apply yeah, right across the piece. We started talking about commercial and enterprise use cases, but the use of AI in these kind of contexts will also need to be subject to legal restrictions and legal review. That's the really hard policy question. So we don't have the rules related to that, but for sure it's a topic that needs to be addressed.
So just going back to the EU's AI regulation, because I'm just sort of conscious that what we've covered so far is quite important key issues, but one thing that people might want to sort of understand is precisely what has it so far, what is it, or maybe in anticipation of what's expected, what will change basically, what could they have done today and they will no longer be able to do once it's all in place.
Yeah, so there's an easy answer and there's a hard answer. So the easy bit,
Hmm.
and because this is a short conversation, this is an easy job for me because the hard bit is how you apply it. So I can say to you, we know the themes to those rules, and they will be familiar. There's nothing new here, and they're not objectionable. So this is things like identification and classification that I described that feeds into risk assessment and risk mitigation. You may have to do fixes once you've done the assessment. Data governance, because we talked already about it comes from the same people that brought us GDPR.
Hmm.
Transparency and control um, given to users. So again, the themes that we see from a lot of legislation that comes out of the Commission has those things in common. Robustness, accuracy, and security. Again, the kind of themes that you have in all regulation of this type. And then one critical thing that I think we're always looking to see is it expressly in regulation. So the European regulation is kind of human in the loop centered. It is human centered, and they have this reference throughout the policy making to this being regulation that is designed to ensure that AI systems are sensitive to human rights and can be controlled by humans and are supportive of existing citizen rights in the European Union. So
Mm.
that's easy. I can kind of rattle through. That's the list that I have in my head of the checklist whenever we have this conversation. First conversation with, say, an organization, could be a government, could be a company, could be any other kind of organization. It says, how do we start thinking about compliance? So we cover that quickly, and then we get into, okay, what's the detail? So the act is relatively short. The regulation's pretty short. And we're going to have to figure out some of the detail through its application by the Commission, but you can't do it through litigation. You can't say, well, we've said that the systems should only be used where they don't cause material harm. So everyone will argue about what's material harm, what's harm, and when is it material? So we're going to rely on standards for that. Standards are going to be super important. ISOs, domestic standards, and again, we've got existing standards. There are already standards, ISOs relating to AI and AI risk management and assurance. So a lot of the kind of practical requirements will come out in standards. And so there's a process of identify the deployments, categorize the deployments, and run that checklist across them that I described to you of, are they transparent? Is there a human in the loop? Is there robust security? Then get into, are we committing to comply with certain standards in our public statements? And therefore, there's a next level of testing against that. And then all of this brings us back to, in the intro, I was saying, this is work that's done between the developers and lawyers and policy and compliance and risk people inside those organizations. So the way that we kind of run the team, we don't want people to just bounce us a policy that says, this is how we intend to comply. What are our comments on it? We want to know how the policy actually interacts with the systems, because you can write a policy that may demonstrate you're 100% compliant, but if you're not following it, or it's not embedded, or there's a mismatch between what the system is doing and how a policy is framing it, then you're not actually compliant. So this is work that requires a collaboration between teams, and we've seen it for a long time in automated systems, smart contracts, and Ricardian contracts. That if you have a smart contract, it's fine for things like payments or decisions relating to binary outcomes, but if you're translating a contract that says has any of those references to reasonableness or materiality or adverse effects or things like that, the smart contract can't interpret that. The oracles are not yet fine-tuned enough. So it's the bit where I describe of we have to shuttle back and forth between the devs and the regulation or the regulators, and make sure that what everyone thinks they're doing is how it's actually being built out and implemented. And that's the most interesting part of the job, because you are in the systems, you're at the level of the devs to make sure that things are working and there's no misunderstanding between the various teams that have to sign off.
I've got to say, it seems incredibly comprehensive, um, in the sense of this checklist that you mentioned. It's an awfully long list, and a lot of the aspects that are being mentioned are even hard to measure and quantify in any literature that I'm aware of. And so it seems like there's going to be an awful lot of work to be done once it's even in place to figure out how the world to navigate these things. Um, something that jumps to mind is there anything that you've noticed, any existing AI practice, not necessarily tied to any particular company, but a particular design pattern, a particular, approach that people commonly use that is unlikely to be um, able to be used once this is sort of fleshed out? I mean, you might need to speculate, perhaps, but
Yeah, so I think the European regulation is a good guide to that. So it's calling out, I've referenced biometric data, facial recognition systems in law enforcement. So you can kind of see where those things are sensitive. But of course, in other jurisdictions, that they would be less sensitive. It is available to policymakers um, for uh, for cultural reasons to say that social cohesion perhaps ranks higher than this individualistic view. So other jurisdictions, perhaps in Asia, may rank some policy aims at a higher level. But in the European framework, it's those kind of um, protected characteristics are the aspects that are significant. And we do see in practice that often facial recognition systems, which can be used in financial institutions, for example, to identify and onboard customers as part of Know Your Customer anti-money laundering practices. When we work on those, and being clear, we work with technical partners for lots of this. So we can understand the technology, but we wouldn't be writing the code. So we'll have technical partners that have software and systems that will look at the application of facial recognition software, and they may say that running tests on that, it is demonstrating some bias. Maybe it has a better recognition rate of certain skin tones than others, for example. So this is the piece where I describe the mitigation. You have remediation that comes out of these exercises. So it's not necessarily the case that those things will be prohibited, but they got to operate in a way that works for all customers in the same way. So they just have to maybe go into the shop, get fixed, and get rolled out again when they're better. So all of this kind of sits on the spectrum, and that's why I think sometimes there's a combination. As you say, the level of detail is part of that kind of auditing system, and the audit industry is pretty good at making judgments around materiality and how those things will work. I think to some extent we will see those decisions automated. If we have maybe I use as an example, if you're just showing a lawyer one AI deployment and asking for a review against the text of the EU AI Act, maybe they could do that in half a day or a day or something like that. But if you have 10,000 deployments in your organization, it's not quick enough to have a human doing it that way. So digital means scalable, and therefore the tools that people use. So we're working with technical partners because you've got to have tools digital tools in order to review digital systems, and that feeds through into the regulators. So RegTech is now pretty familiar. This is technology that helps people comply with their regulations, but
Mm.
we're in the early stages of what we call SUP tech, supervisory technology. So this
Mm.
is the regulators will need to have tools that they can use to review the digital systems and technologies that the firms that they regulate use. So this is like a wave that the technology hits, and then there are policy um, consequences, and then you get the regulation, and then you get methods of complying with the regulation at scale, and then you get the regulators that are following. So this part of the process is certainly familiar to lawyers and firms, that there's um, a series of steps that are followed, and different organizations will take different views about how they want to comply. For example, if the EU AI Act is a tougher set of regulations than, say, what gets adopted in the UK. I've worked in UK policy circles on AI for about 7 years now. We don't have that text yet. So it may be that there's a political view that having a less customer-centric and a more enterprise-centric regulation would be better. So then organizations that work in the UK and in the EU will have a choice. If we're complying with the EU rules because they're tougher than the UK, in my thought experiment, then by definition, we're complying with the UK rules. That's a higher bar. So is there any benefit in having systems operating in the UK that are working at to the UK regulation only? So they wouldn't be compliant with the EU rules, but they are
Mm.
compliant with the UK rules. So then you've got this kind of cost benefit trade-off to say, well, there may be some commercial benefit in having a lower standard of compliance, but we're going to have two sets of systems and maintain them, and two sets of compliance teams or rules. So is it worth it? In the beginning, people may just say, we've got the EU rules, we've built out our systems, manual and digital, to comply with them. That took time and was expensive. So we're just going to stick with that. If the rules are different elsewhere and would require less to comply with, we're just going to over comply. Too expensive to do something different. So all of
Yeah, I can
these
see
things are
that.
kind of work through.
Interesting. So that's what I guess it goes back to something you mentioned earlier, where you were saying that there is a level of importance with these EU-based regulations that go beyond just the jurisdictional aspects, because it seems to have sort of a first mover kind of level setting effect.
Yeah, being
Um,
first
where, where,
matters.
where do you think we're no doubt going to see in the coming years other jurisdictions roll these things out? Where are we likely to see them? With the US, that's such a big market. It seems to be it doesn't have the same attention to these aspects of AI, although it clearly has some other aspects it's already attended to. Is that going to be the likely next big market to regulate, or what would you expect?
Yeah, so the US culturally is more of a free market. So they tend to um, answer policy questions by being more pro-business than pro-consumer. That's generally been the kind of
I see.
easy distinction to make between US and EU. So they may not. The UK is probably interesting because it often sits in the middle of those
Hmm.
two, and the most similar regulation that we've had recently is online safety legislation. So this is the rules that kind of push platforms to ensure that they are not harmful to users, particularly users who are minors. And that was a very challenging piece of legislation to get through. It went through some years worth of policy work and then a long time of having text that was amended on a number of occasions. So this is hard stuff to put in place. It's difficult to get general um, uh, a view at a society level. Yeah. So are the politicians leading and trying to persuade society that this is the right way of framing the regulation, or are the politicians trying to figure out what would be acceptable in their society and produce regulation that fits with that? It's generally a bit of both, but that's how this stuff gets made. And because it is so uh, prevalent and so um, uh, so often updated. We're seeing, we had the GPT-4 developer conference that's produced new materials. We have, and maybe we can use this to sort of touch on the federated learning. So I see that a decentralized AI system has just got funding announced overnight or this morning. So that references or picks up references to two things that we talked about already. So one, decentralization is generally thought of as a crypto principle. It's not. It's a developer principle. So GitHub and things like that, the community is decentralized outside of crypto and blockchain. So these technologies, I think, bring the community standards of tech developers into the mainstream. That's one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to explain to large enterprises that have not experienced that so much in the past. And then we also have that question of, is decentralization suitable from a technological perspective? Does it have a competition benefit? So obviously, a lot of the large language models currently have been developed by existing incumbents in the space, but in Europe, we had an example of a startup getting very substantial funding. So you have the political consideration there and a societal consideration around the extent to which there should be a competitive landscape. And we don't need new rules for that. We've got antitrust and competition rules in every jurisdiction already. That the larger you get as an organization, that the more those sort of things touch on you and the more dominant you are in a market. So those rules will come in. And I think federated learning is absolutely consistent with AI, because that is the philosophy behind the developers and the community. These things are, we've said in many ways during this conversation, these things are significant to society. So we want as many people involved in their development and policy around them as possible. We've already got the users. So we know on those graphs that each new thing gets to 100 million users before the previous new thing. That is now the cliche. So we just want to ensure that people who are using them are able to have some influence on what it is that they're using. So you didn't ask me specifically about federated learning, but I think that some of the themes that we've been discussing kind of prompts an answer in that respect.
Well, we can move on to that, and there's a way to sort of kind of wrap things up a bit more. Obviously, our audience and our community is really interested in federated learning, and it seems to me, at least, that on many dimensions, of course not all, but in many dimensions, it will be easier to comply with these types of regulations if you build your systems in a federated manner. Perhaps we could go through just a few of these examples, and you could correct me if I'm thinking incorrectly, or maybe if I'm missing something out. But I imagine, for one, from a data point of view, there is this expectation or higher requirements for being more cautious with user data that kind of extends from GDPR. And of course, federated learning provides you with a lot of flexibility in how you can architect solutions of that kind. I suppose also it allows you to better comply with different AI regulation spheres, because you mentioned earlier that if you develop for one region and then want to deploy to another, if there has a slightly different set of requirements in a sort of like a centralized monolithic design, kind of changing the data tier or where the data comes from when you train the model, or changing the way that the models are served and everything, is much more complex to kind of make those modifications. But if you have built your system as a collection of compatible computing units and data sources, it just seems conceptually that you could align easier with those regulations. What would, for you, when you look at these list of requirements people need to kind of nail, what for you do you think federated systems might be able to help people with compliance beyond those two?
I think precisely as you say, so things like transparency and composability, the ability to have a less monolithic system. And one of the risks that we kind of flag on investment transactions, if an investor or venture capital firm is putting money into a business that's been developing AI systems, then if data has been used to build the model, which should not have been used, data that for some reason was prohibited, then the value of the whole model is in question. So one of the probably the hardest question, or the most significant piece of diligence around investment transactions, is having transparency and clarity that the model has been trained on data that is available to it and freely available to it. So these are hard questions, and we can see again there are different policy responses. The LLM firms naturally take the view that it's not necessary to formally license every type of data, and that is a view that's not necessarily shared widely. So that you see these policy questions being played out, depending on where you sit in the room, you got a different opinion. But I think the point you make is that federated learning gives more that there is more human in the loop and more optionality around how you are dealing with building and deployment and use and further updating. And I think that's the kind of thing that is valuable from a functionality perspective, but it is also valuable from that regulatory analysis perspective. It means that you've got the ability to pivot more and build differently depending on how these things land in policy and legal terms.
It's interesting what you bring when you raise this issue of sources of data, and once you've trained the model, that model itself may no longer be able to be used, depending on what sort of happens to how people regulate data. And although that these problems haven't been framed in this way to federated learning before, it's not that hard to imagine how you could have federated training where you're concurrently building different models from different data sources, with each style of learning to comply with different like markets. You could have, or you could even have other ways of reusing different parts later. So you'd like to have an eventual endpoint where you could deploy to a market, know that sort of data can't be used in that situation, and basically not have that part of the data embedded inside the model. And whether you can certainly do that, and as the process of training is happening, if you kind of think about how you want to do it, it'd be much more beneficial if you could do it after the fact, but that would require deeper thought. But certainly you can imagine how this would be much more feasible in federated situations, especially if you want to uh, add in data later or rule it out in a much more modular way.
Yeah, it will be valuable. And of course, everything comes with trade-offs. So um, the value will be set against the complexity of the number of developers who may not be aligned. So in a corporation, your employment contract says that if you're writing code in the course of your employment, then it's owned by the corporation. So in each of these cases, you're looking at what is the improvement and also what are the trade-offs and how do you deal with those? And it may be we should sort of give an example to illustrate the kind of thing that we're talking about. So the most obvious example for training data where the greatest care has to be taken is in healthcare use cases. There's a there's a real balance in that we are seeing that AI and Gen AI is fantastically good at supporting diagnosis and um, uh, medical drug development, for example. But if it's read my health records in order to be um, able to do that, and I haven't given approval, then there's a question about the model in those circumstances. So this is the point where, as you say, there's care going in, but the ability to be able to iterate at a later stage, I think is inevitably going to be valuable because there will be things that come to light, or there may be changes in law, or there may be changes in the internal policy of the organization, or it may be requirements that are set by a counterparty. So your systems are not doing anything illegal, but you want to work with a counterparty that has, say, some internal ethical policy that means that it's not illegal, but it's something that they wouldn't be prepared to engage with. So that adaptability, I think, is going to be one of the things that becomes a hallmark of how people do comply with regulation, and the regulators would be interested in it for sure.
Mm-hmm. And also the aspect of transparency will be helped if these AI systems are a true collaboration of entities rather than, because right now when you have an entity collaborating in a current, centralized form, what that typically means is entity A just gives entity B perhaps some data, and then they just like hope, or maybe it's contractually enforced of what model is produced, but it's certainly not very transparent. It's basically like a truck proposal. They take it to a black box, they produce a model. We hope that model is doing what we intend, which is, on the other hand, if we're building these in a more federated, more modular, collaborative manner, then entities could actually be more evenly participating. And then regulators who look into this, they can see that, the pharma company has some AI scientists and they have some data. They might be working with another AI company or another uh, important ingredient to that solution, and they're working much more as true even participants. That seems to be something that will be promoted increasingly. And it's interesting because we're talking about a situation that's sort of moving. We're kind of
Yeah.
we have to be very speculative about where things are going, and then some of the lead times for building these systems, particularly when you're building hardware, but also a lot of the infrastructure is longer in terms of lead time for what we might start seeing down the pipe into the regulation.
Yeah, and
Um,
this is right in the middle of that distinction that I drew between, let's say, US and European Union views of this, that the US is more comfortable with digital markets having a winner takes all kind of
mm,
outcome than in Europe currently. Um, and even outside digital markets, so as you were describing that, one example in my mind is in the UK and some other jurisdictions, we have what are known as open banking rules.
mhm.
So this is to support competition. The banking regulators require large incumbents to share customer data subject to the customer's consent. And that means that customers are able to get access to uh, in this financial services case, challenger banks, startups, fintechs, and folks of that type who may have more suitable products, but they would only know that if they're given access to the data that is inside the walled garden of the incumbent, because people tend not to change their bank accounts for decades. So we see the open banking rules being a good example of financial regulators, but regulators all see the world kind of the same way, trying to um, improve competition, and sharing data was the perceived solution to that.
I see. Yes, makes sense. Well, I guess we better start to wrap up. I think we're running a bit low on time. I just wanted to ask one last very short question that people will be really curious about, and that is from a researcher point of view. If you're just a researcher working in a university or in some other type of institution where you're doing AI research, are there any things that they need to be aware of right now, or are these all just concerns that are going to be coming down the downstream? But is there anything they need to be thinking about currently that might change their current methods or practices at all?
So that's a great question. And I'll probably have a better answer for you when you hit the stop recording button. So we might add to it after the video, but I think there are lots of available materials, and we can share some in the links or show notes. And I guess I would have to say I've talked so much about collaboration through this, and I'm sitting in a group of 10 specialists. So we work together pretty much on everything, or we know what each other are doing, because this is not the type of um, the questions that arise are not the type of questions that one person just takes away, comes back with the answer.
Oh,
So
sure.
I think the audience you're describing is probably already widely collaborating. Of course, the context of your channel will tell us that. So they should also collaborate with the legal departments in
I
universities
see.
and the philosophy departments in universities. So they're getting that kind of legal, regulatory, ethical support in what they're doing. We have relationships with computer science teams in universities and legal departments, and they're very fruitful. I think this stuff is difficult and fascinating, but it's kind of self-selecting. So if you find someone in the legal department of your organization that is interested, then by definition, they're probably a good partner for you. So you want to have curious, open-minded people who are trying to push themselves and figure out new things. It's quite self-selecting. People find themselves working together because they have a common interest and they can bring their specialist skill sets together.
I see. Excellent. Yeah, I was. So it seems like you're really advising people when they think about this topic. If you're a researcher, to think beyond your domain and reach out to folks in legal, philosophy, all sorts of which for most academics are actually quite accessible if they just take the time, and that could really lead them to thinking about this differently. Um, Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. It's super valuable time, no doubt. And thank you for helping us unpack the sort of moving space that no doubt will affect uh, us in our private lives and our professional lives so much. And it still is very early days. So thank you, Charles, so much. I appreciate the time today with you. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Nick, and we'll continue working together, and I'll see you again soon.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much.